Just in front of me on the camera is our presenter for this workshop, Reverend Al Sharp. He's the executive director of the Clergy for a New Drug Policy. And the so-called war on drugs is the longest war in the history of our nation. We've been hearing about Afghanistan being the longest war. Well, the war on drugs has been longer. This drug war is theologically and morally wrong. It calls for punishment in the form of jail and prison for individuals using drugs, including those who are addicted. It continues to devastate especially communities of color. Churches have an obligation to seek healing rather than incarceration in response to drug use, and to bring this tragic war to an end. This workshop will make clear why it is our responsibility to end the war on drugs, identify the targets of advocacy toward this end, and describe the ways in which you can bring forth voices for justice within your congregation. Al has said this is going to be interactional and a conversation. So I actually may go back on Zoom so I can read the chat. Our virtual participants, just put your questions in the chat or comments as we are discussing, and I will be the relay person for it. With that, I'm going to give you the microphone to clip on wherever you want.
Okay. Let's see. I'm not sure. I guess, does this work here? No, okay. Okay, does this sound okay? Excellent, thank you. Not too loud. Okay, good to see you all. I think what this shows is that advocacy has to become an increasing presence in the mind of a lot of us, because we're a small but hardy band, but I'm sure you know the saying that, you know, the few good, what has been changed except by a few good people in the world, wherever else has that happened. I will start by telling you a little bit about myself, so you know where these thoughts and opinions are coming from. And we've seen in our first two keynote speakers that the personal biographies are a major part of what the presentations are, and maybe that will be true here. I do want this to be interactive, both from the folks that are online and the folks in this room, because that, one, it makes it come alive. It also means that my own comments are kind of hitting the mark, or at least I know where I should be trying to hit the mark, and your questions will inform me. So just a little about myself. I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, as the son of a Presbyterian minister. I would say emphasis on the Presbyterian. A little dour, a little hard to smile, deeply fine person, long tradition of Presbyterian ministers. My grandfather, my father's father, had emigrated from Liverpool, England, as a 15-year-old. I'm not sure of the family legend, but I believe it. The idea was that there'd been a lot of drinking in my grandfather's family. They were shipbuilders on the docks of Liverpool. My grandfather may or may not have heard Dwight Lyman Moody, the great evangelist, who took his message to Europe and certainly the British Isles. In any event, I got to know my grandfather, and of course was raised in my father's home. Both were teetotalers, and as indeed was my mother, who grew up in Chicago. But she grew up in a family that did not drink at all. Just a little vignette, fast forwarding probably 40 years later, I moved to Chicago and looked for where my mother had grown up, in a fairly nice neighborhood in Chicago on Pine Grove, for anyone near North Side, for anybody of you who know Chicago. And my father's house, and he'd become very well appointed at that point, was a very nice home. And I didn't know what it was. I knocked on the door. It turns out it was a men's club, not of ill repute, just a men's club where people could gather, and women were welcome as well. And I remember having visited there as about a 4 or 5-year-old boy. I remember the living room, the steps going upstairs. Well, in the living room was now a bar because it was a men's club. And I'm not a teetotaler. And so I remember that experience with the gentleman who invited me to become a member, of sitting at the bar and maybe not having one drink too many, but remembering how my mother had been raised, and the fact that I've had to come to terms with that upbringing in a whole lot of different ways. And so that was kind of an interesting moment. In terms of what's relevant to this workshop, I have the dream job and the dream life, if you will. I am doing and have done all my life the work that I most enjoyed. I don't think I've ever had an experience, which I so much hope that other people don't have, and I know many do, of going to work one day and saying, why am I doing what I'm doing? I don't really care about this. My combination is public policy and theology, and increasingly, as we will hear in this workshop, the whole question of addiction. Because my father was a minister, the oak doesn't fall far from the tree. It wasn't surprising that when I finished my college years, I didn't know what to do. I'd been very involved in journalism, had run the college newspaper. And since I didn't know what I wanted to do, I didn't study as hard as other people did who knew that they had to get straight A's to get into Harvard Law School. So I spent most of my time actually running the newspaper. But deep down, I think I knew I was going to go to divinity school. So I indeed did apply to Union Theological Seminary in New York City. I got a grant for people just like me, didn't know what they were going to do as a committed vocation, but they were willing to explore it. And I loved my time. I spent that first year there, but it was the Kennedy years, and excitement was all around us, and urban issues were, right in front of us. And I found the opportunity to teach in a Harlem public school, just to get a summer program and go into a Harlem school at 135th Street and Amsterdam Avenue. And I did that. And with that taste of immediacy, I knew I wasn't going right back to Union Theological Seminary. I think deep down, I said to myself, okay, I'll become a pastor. I'll go into the suburbs. What will I do with all these issues, public issues that were so exciting in those times? So what will I do with those issues in that setting? Let me ask this then for a show of hands. How many of you know William Sloane Coffin? Does anyone know that name? Does that mean anything to you? Well, that's the generation. Yeah, that was the generation gap. He is my hero. He was the chaplain of Yale. He became very active in the freedom movement for civil rights, was on the first Freedom Ride bus in 1961, was a great activist in opposing the Vietnam War. So I was filled with Bill Coffin even as I was in divinity school. And I knew I was going to try to be immediately out in the world. So I did that year of teaching and then went to a school of public policy. There were only 3 in those days, and I went to one of them. Loved that work. And so I went into public policy work. My first job was in the Department of Higher Education in New Jersey, where we built an education system. I worked for a wonderful person there. I did that for a period of time. Moved to Massachusetts, where I worked for Governor Dukakis and eventually ended up running the welfare department in Massachusetts, Department of Public Aid. But again, you can see the public service, the public issues interest. And then was called to the University of Chicago, where I was the financial vice president. And again, the constant theme is I never woke up wondering why I was doing what I was doing. For me, the University of Chicago was and is one of the great institutions of the world, not related to drug policy, not even related to public policy, although they do have a school of public policy. But I feel if the cataclysm were to come and you could save only a few institutions, one of the institutions you would want to save are the great research universities, of which the University of Chicago is one. So I spent 12 years of my life there. It was a chance to raise my family, One of the beauties of being in a setting like that was that I could actually go home for lunch. I could know my kids, and I deeply appreciate that. But then the chance came to um, go back to divinity school. They have a great divinity school at the University of Chicago. I was now in my mid-40s. I won't call it a midlife crisis because it wasn't that, but I knew that if I didn't do it then, I would never have the chance. So I just walked across the quadrangle. I stopped going into the administration building and started going to divinity school. And 2.5 years later, there was, and this is where our stuff kicks in, there was an organization that was starting called Protestants for the Common Good. There were a group of individuals that had an idea about public advocacy around the concept of the common good. And you can imagine what the issues were. You could define what it is that helps us achieve the common good: housing issues, income support issues, fair elections, fighting payday loans. Criminal justice was not the issue then that it is now, but we took that on as well. And I agreed to start that. I did that for 12 years, running that organization. I can identify with Pastor Ed and his role because he's building an organization. He's starting from scratch. And we did that with Protestants for the Common Good. But what really became relevant to our work here today was that somebody suggested that we put on our agenda something that we hadn't had at that point, which was the notion of what about people that need a second chance in our society? What a concept. You know, you go to prison and you come out and what happens? Well, one of the great myths, as I'm sure you know, is you ever really pay your debt to society. The notion of a second chance in society for people that are coming back, trying to re-enter their lives is at best a myth. Sometimes you can break through a myth. So let's hope sometimes we do, but it's awfully hard to do that. And, you know, it's literally true that when people come out of prison in Illinois, they're given maybe $50 and a bus ticket. And often they're taken back to the same neighborhoods that they came from without even the money to, spend the night, get a hotel room somewhere. Compounding their problems are, and this is something that we're working on now, and another group that I'm a part of, they often don't have an identification. I don't know if you know this issue in your own state, but pay attention to it. You come out of prison, very often you don't have a state ID. If you don't have an ID, you certainly can't get a job. You can't do anything, really. And we've been working on that problem for 15 years since I've been involved in public advocacy, and it's still not solved. They now have a private pilot project that's going from prison to prison and trying to make sure that prisons work on this before individuals come out, but it's still only a pilot project. But in any event, so we took on the issue of people who need a second chance. And we found, for example, that of 97 professions that have licensure requirements, almost all of them, over 50 of them, had barriers to working in those professions if you had anything like a drug offense on your record. The point being that as we saw all these people that were coming out of prisons whom we wanted to help, what we found was that the people that were in prison were there mostly for drug offenses. So you really had to get at why they were there in the first place if you wanted to really help them. And how could you help them if you weren't changing some of the laws that made it impossible for them to re-enter their society? Now, I'd like to know, just to test, I brought 3 books. This is the first one that I'm simply going to hold up for people listening remotely, but for you as well. It's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in an Age of Colorblindness. Maybe a show of hands. How many of you have either read this book, heard of it, or even taken it to your churches? Michelle Alexander wrote this book in 2010. She was a lawyer and a professor at the Ohio State, and she was trying to help folks coming out of prison, and she began to put together the fact that the reason our prisons were increasing and we were creating a new era of mass incarceration was because of our drug laws. Now, you can look at the statistics now and say that the same percentage of people who were in prison for drug laws in 2010 that same percentage is not as high, but it was the drug laws themselves that took us into a new era of an era of mass incarceration, from about 500,000 people interacting with our criminal justice system in 2070 to over 2.3 million now. 2.3 million, an exponential growth. And she was the one that identified that. I am pausing because one of the instruments of advocacy that I've given you is something called the religious declaration. Some of these figures that I'm giving you are on that declaration. And you see the figure 2.3 million in the United States, more than any other nation on the planet, including Russia, South America, and China. We punish people for drug use. And so much of this is racially driven. I have figures on this religious declaration, and they're still proportionally true. 1 in every 4 individuals, Caucasians, have interaction with the criminal justice system now, or did in 2006. 1 of every 34 Latino men, and these are male statistics, but increasingly women are caught up in the criminal justice system. 1 in every 15 Blacks are caught up in the criminal justice system. And in Illinois, it's fair to say that we have more people of color in our prisons than we have in our system of higher education. And that 1/3, I think this is true nationally, it's certainly true in Illinois, 1/3 of Black men born today will face some interaction, and that means incarceration in our criminal justice system. And it was Michelle Alexander looking at our drug laws that brought our national attention to that. I like to think of her as the Uncle Tom's Cabin author of the 21st century. And I bring this religious declaration to your attention, first of all, as an instrument of advocacy. I wanted to show that our organization had credibility, so I worked very hard to publicize this, ask people to sign it. If you actually want to sign this document and bring it up to the table, you will be one of over 1,000 people whose names we can use to say that this is a real organization and that we do bring real advocacy to the various states, and we'll talk about how we do that. So I hope you will. You don't literally need to sign it. You can go onto our website and sign it there, but it is an instrument of advocacy, and I offer that to you as simply a vehicle of advocacy. Now, about this workshop, let me give you some benchmarks for what I want to do with it, and so you can kind of have a mental roadmap of where we are as we go through, what the real underlying structure is. The first is, and it might be a little abstract, hopefully not, that's where the interaction comes in. How do we think about advocacy? Especially how do we think about advocacy in your churches? You know, that's not a no-brainer. A lot depends on the kind of church, the size of the church, the orientation, almost, if you could say this, the ideology of most of the faith assumptions of most of the people there. So I want to just talk about that a little bit. Then the second thing will be what we might advocate for. Obviously, you know, the mission statement of Clergy for a New Drug Policy. We want to end the war on drugs. One thing, if you ever do want to start your organization, you might want to keep in mind is have an elevator speech. We didn't have one for Protestants for the Common Good. It was very complicated. We had a multi-issue agenda. We only reached out to Protestants. Why was that? Individuals, congregations shouldn't, I believe, take positions on issues as a congregation, but individuals, the people of faith, should take a stand, take position. How do you reconcile all that? So I didn't have an elevator speech. By the time I explained how we were and what we did, most people were rolling their eyes, even if they were excited about the individual issues. The beauty of Clergy for a New Drug Policy, one is it has a name that tells people what we are. So if you ever do start an organization, I spent about 2 years thinking of this name, Clergy for a New Drug Policy. It ain't flashy, but you know what? People get it. The second thing is have an elevator speech. Our elevator speech is the mission of Clergy for a New Drug Policy, is to mobilize clergy nationally to end the war on drugs and seek a health or more religiously oriented, a healing approach to drug policy. So that's who and what we are. And I will talk about our advocacy in relation to drug policy and to that mission. And then the third thing that I hope you'll come away with is, how do we actually do that? I've been doing this for 20 years, so I could give you a long lecture, kind of a brain dump, but let's try to be more interactive about that as well. So that's the frame. That's who we are. Let me stop now and simply ask you to tell me a little bit about advocacy in your churches, even if it's not in the church where you are now, what's your experience with it in institutions of faith, because it's not obvious how to do that. I mean, Bill Coffin, my idol, we gave a 75th birthday party for him, and he gave a wonderful address. I urge you to become acquainted with him at some point, William Sloane Coffin. And he started out by saying, I believe the church is a social movement. He believes that. He's not apologetic at all about advocacy. But I'll tell you this, if I go up to the North Shore of Chicago, where you've got the wealthiest suburban communities rivaled only by Greenwich and New Canaan, Connecticut, where in fact I grew up, if you start talking about tax policy, you start talking about anything that has any economic implication, they won't pay any attention to you. They won't want you there. I needed funding. I went to those churches for funding, and all we could do was pretend that we were only an educational organization. We didn't really stand for anything, although I don't think I quite conveyed that. So how do you do advocacy in church? But what's your experience? How about you? Do you have your own church, and is there advocacy at all in your church? How do you think about that?
And, I'm Troy from Cross Lutheran Church in Roberts, Wisconsin, and we have just...
Let me ask online, Arthur, can you hear what's being said? Okay, go ahead.
Everybody, can they hear me? I can speak up. So I'm Troy from Cross Lutheran Church in Roberts, and we have just started our recovery evangelism committee, and we got like 6 of us here for this conference this weekend. And we just recently have proposed a survey to our congregation, and we're looking to get results back from that and have a sit down and see where we're going to go. The reason for this conference is to have an open mind and a willingness to share, because we know we have a problem in our community with this. And I for one am very thankful and grateful recovering alcoholic. One day at a time, knock on wood, that come the 13th of October I'll have 2 years sobriety. So, and I've been taught, so to speak, my education background in this wonderful world of addiction has come from the wonderful brothers and sisters in my family at Alcoholics Anonymous, and to expand on the experience, strength, and hope, and share that with, it's like the 12th step.
Yep.
The spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, and to practice these principles in all our affairs. And that's the reason I'm here.
Good. Well, that is a form of advocacy, and I tell you, I'm very heartened by the conference and by the people I'm talking to. I do a lot of blogging, and I hope you'll come to. Actually, I'll put my card here because it has our website. If you'd like to be a part of knowing what we're doing, I blog pretty frequently. Just pick these up if you'd like to. And my most recent blog was this week. And I tried to publicize the conference and was trying to explain why this was so important to me. And I started out with the notion of basically you have a church, you have a sanctuary upstairs, and then you have Alcoholics Anonymous meeting in the basement, and never the twain meet. What I'm finding, yeah.
I put NA upstairs.
Good. Terrific. Well, I'm finding, that we're further along. we're further along than I'd realized. I mean, I think it's true of my church at home, it's true of an awful lot of other churches that I see. But how to close that gap is a part of advocacy, because if you begin to bring things together and talk about why we are where we are, you're in the first stages of advocacy. Although there are different kinds of advocacy, and those don't approach all that we can do. How about you, sir? Are you a member of a church? I am. And do you have what we might call advocacy in your church? To test the question, do you bring forward public issues for discussion? Do you mobilize people to speak out on those issues? Do you do anything with legislation in your state? There are various forms of advocacy. We've talked first about what I would call soft advocacy. Who you bring in as a speaker in your church is a form of advocacy. But hard advocacy, I don't know why I use that word, but hardcore, serious advocacy can be traveling to, in my case, Springfield, our state capital. So how does advocacy come out at all, if in any way, in your church?
Well, the one program that I've been thinking about while you've been talking is we participate in a number of, I'm in St. Petersburg, Florida.
Yeah.
We participate in a number of community organizations that are run, multiple pastors participated in this, partner with the police. One in particular that we've been involved with is called Not My Son, which is young people pledge not to settle problems with gun violence, and adults pledge to know where their kids are. We go around, we have a food truck and drive, come out as a safe place for people to come and be. But one of the things that is on that pledge that has troubled me is a pledge not to use marijuana, right? And I think that that's, I'm not sure how I feel about that. Like, if that's going to actually be helpful in getting young people to pay attention to the other things on the pledge, because not settling a problem with gun violence as one of the same items as don't smoke pot doesn't seem right. And if they're going to disregard one, well, they disregard everything, right? And so thinking about that, but this is a major. The city partners with churches to do this, to create safe programs for kids, after school programs, all comes under an umbrella. We sometimes host it. Provide volunteers to go help participate in it, but exactly where we're going with that, I don't know. Now, I personally am in recovery, and that has not intersected particularly deeply with programs that we're offering at the church. It's just part of the picture of who I am.
Okay. Okay.
I'm an Episcopal priest.
Oh, thank you for that. Well, I will ask, since you are an Episcopal priest, I will ask if the name Richard Rohr has come to your attention.
Sure.
Good. Well, we're in a world of spiritual, not religious. Churches, the mainline churches, in my experience, are declining. And for me, and the people that aren't coming to church, more and more are grouping themselves under this title. They don't want organized religion, so they're not consciously grouping themselves, but they're there. And the person that most gives articulation, this is my Monday blog, to bringing the sanctuary and the basement together, to speaking to people who are spiritual and not religious, is indeed Richard Rohr. And I light up mostly with the Episcopal mention, because what I'm picking up is the Episcopal Church, more than most others, is most open to Richard Rohr for some reason. I'm not sure why, but at least that's what I've heard. So we're wandering around here, but that's what I want to do. How about?
I have two comments from people who are online.
Please.
So Karina Warner says, we have a chemical recovery ministry. I am part of a non-denominational church. No advocacy. I am sad about it.
Okay. Karina will help you with that.
Good. And then Mary Sanders says my two congregations participate when COVID allows a couple of times a year with Livingstone's congregation, the Lutheran congregation inside the Washington State Correctional Facility in Shelton, Washington, that her son-in-law is the pastor at, but she didn't say that. The board of that ministry has been working towards a worshiping group for recently released folks, and since many incarcerations are drug-related, some connection there. Also, I'm a pastor, also alcoholic, and I frequently share my own experience, truth, and hope in the context of regular church life, like text studies and sermons and pastoral care.
Okay.
Thanks, Mary.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to, any Joy, or do you have thoughts you want to express?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
so much reaction to some of the things that you brought up in your speech, but in terms of advocacy in my congregation, I'm also an Episcopal priest, and I work in Nashua, New Hampshire at the moment. My name's Mike Green, by the way. This is something I've been passionate about for a long time. I was really excited this year's session here about the public policy piece of this because it's a huge thing. Our congregation is, I was attracted to the ministry there and took the gig because they've got, I think, 23 different 12-step groups that meet throughout the course of the week. And it didn't take too long in the congregation before I became the chaplain to the mayor's opioid task force. Boy, that opened my eyes to a whole different level of addiction and sick subsistence in our culture that I had no idea about until we started hearing from some law enforcement people about that. I think it's essential in this day and age for congregations to at least have their foot in that door, because that is where the rubber meets the road for so many people. We talk about like wanting to have our doors open to people who are searching. Well, here are people who are searching for a model of life where hardness of heart is not the rule, and that's what we stand for. And you know, the Richard Rohr stuff is another great piece in that. My background before I was ordained, I worked like you in academia at the University of Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.
The departmental registrar for the Fells Institute of Government, which is their public policy school. And I worked with Larry Sherman, who was a criminologist and a police scientist primarily, who did all of this work on a subject called restorative justice.
Yes.
Which I think is a great model for this conversation.
Yes.
The idea that you put people who have been hurt and the people who have done hurting together to pursue some reconciliation and that human interaction. There's, I mean, the science almost immediately shows that there is a kind of I mean, it's a whole other set of possibilities there. It doesn't always work. There's always sort of outliers and all of that. But the amount of recidivism, the amount of pushback that you get from the community about, like, this is not the kind of people we want to deal with. Suddenly they're like, hey, this is actually a human being. That's a very big deal. And finally, just this one last word. I did a book study on the new Jim Crow.
Oh, good. Good.
In my church, and what they came away with was that it was not anywhere near far enough. It was way too short. Jim Crow is a bad description. The new slavery should have been the title of the book.
Yeah, for those who haven't read the book, the Jim Crow idea is that we had slavery, Jim Crow after the Civil War, and our drug policies now are the third Jim Crow. So,
but we're paying people ridiculous prison wages.
Yeah.
The population of prison is all people of color.
Yep.
They're doing grunt work, like making license plates and doing telemarketing and all that kind of stuff in for-profit prisons.
Yep.
Where people's shareholders are being enriched by their work. And how is that different from a cotton plantation?
Yep.
Not at all.
Well, thank you for those comments, because it really segues into the notion of public policy issues as things that we work on in our advocacy work. We've talked a lot about what we're doing to increase awareness in our churches and engage even with the community and the interaction with law enforcement. And that's all wonderful. And that's helpful for me to hear that, because even though I knew this, it helps me realize that is really a form of advocacy that can pervade all that we're doing. I would distinguish public policy advocacy. And when we mentioned restorative justice, it fits with the second book that I wanted to bring to you, which is a book that was actually written by a man named T. Richard Snyder. And it was done 4 or 5 years before the new Jim Crow. And it has a wonderful title. I introduce it, if only because of its title, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Punishment. You all know the Max Weber book about the spirit of capitalism, the spirit of punishment, Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Punishment. Well, T. Richard Snyder used that title, and what he points out is, before Michelle Alexander's book, that we have a neighborhood to prison pipeline. He was at New York Theological Seminary, and he I don't have the exact numbers in my head, but probably 50% of the people in Sing Sing were right up the river from where he had his seminary, were from about 3 or 4 boroughs or districts in Manhattan, and mostly people of color. And yes.
I was just trying to find time. We have one more comment from
Sure.
the chat if you're ready.
Of course.
So Karina Warner also says, also she thinks her church equates social justice with the Democratic Party. Yeah. And I think they'd advocate for social justice. They think if they'd advocate for social justice, they will take sides and alienate the Republicans.
Right. Well, that, again, I'm going to allow this discussion to go into all 3 of the things that I wanted to come away with. Advocacy in churches is hard, and how you do it in a church setting is hard. So, Joy?
So this is what I'm thinking. So my call is to Rosencrantz Jackson Center. I'm on the roster ELCA clergy, but my call is to Rosencrantz Jackson Center. Advocacy in a congregation when you're the sole pastor is a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
And if you talk about criminal justice issues, you talk about restorative justice, then they'll say you're being political.
Yep.
Right? Which is the gospel pretty political.
Yep.
Right? So, right? So I have this wonderful position, whereas I'm called to Rosencrantz Jackson Center, which makes me free to do pulpit supply. So that I can go into congregations and I can preach about criminal justice reform. I can preach about advocacy. I can preach about addiction from the pulpit, because we know that there's no congregation that is not touched by addiction.
Yes.
In some way. And it frees people to think I'm seen, I'm known. So I get to do that and then run away. So I don't have to deal with councils. I don't have to deal with, those people that always think they should control what's being said in the pulpit. But it's dangerous work.
It is dangerous work, and I Protestants for the Common Good spent an awful lot of time working with pastors and congregations about how to address exactly those issues. Was it Mary Sanders who asked the question? Somebody asked that question. Here are some particular slants into answering the question. First, I will say as a pastor, there's a distinction between issues that are moral issues and issues that are political issues. A moral issue can be a political issue, but there are some that are political in a different way, and moral in a different way. And the distinction for me, I have never had a congregation, and I haven't had to face those difficulties. I had an organization that was trying to help people face that difficulty. But if I were a pastor like Ed Treat was, I would say that from the pulpit, I can speak on what are moral positions. Issues where to say there are 2 sides, of course, is always true, but that I can say that this is the morally right answer, and I will listen to your side. I will not cease to love you and to care about you and listen to you, but I would say this is morally right for everybody. And I would say, for example, I could preach on solitary confinement in prison and simply say that's a moral issue. You were in effect killing people. You're destroying them mentally if you have abusive policies of solitary confinement. What would be some other ones? I actually think it's a moral issue to and this is where it's going to get difficult. It's morally wrong to put somebody in prison for drug use. Now, distinguish trafficking. Trafficking, you want to stop that, and you want to fight against that. But simply because somebody has put a substance in his or her body, often for reasons they have very little control over, to turn them into criminals, I think is morally wrong. It's morally wrong to treat somebody as a criminal for using a substance. And I would preach on that. And I would get a heck of a lot of pushback from our congregation. I know that. But that's something I think we could push on.
Here's the thing, though,
Yep.
is that so much,
George, people are having a hard time hearing you.
Oh, okay.
Either speak up or.
I can do that. Addiction is seen by so many people as a moral issue.
Yes.
And so particularly the church is responsible for a lot of that stigma.
Yep.
And a lot of that shame. And so that's why people shut up about it. And so
Yep.
there's that challenge.
Right.
To bring up addiction as an issue of justice, an issue of public health,
Yep.
an issue of caring for our neighbor. It's a hard switch for people to get to.
Yeah.
So why should we care about these immoral people?
Yeah. Well, that is the essence of what this conference is about.
Right.
It's about our deepest theology. It's about how Jesus responded to the suffering in our midst, some of which in his day was surely some kind of addiction. How we respond to it, how we understand addiction, as opposed to how society understands addiction. And that's why I like this title so much, The Spirit of Punishment. Our drug policies, the church can bring forward an understanding of addiction. It can talk about forgiveness and compassion and healing as how we should respond, not punishment. But here's why advocacy is important, and here's why I want all the folks at this conference, and indeed the mission of this conference, to care about advocacy, because unless through advocacy we affect how the public thinks and repeal those laws that are expressions of punishment, it's going to be a lot harder for us to do what we want to do in churches. You got it's two hands clapping. You got the outside that has to understand that these laws are wrong, and advocates can help to change that. And you've got people in the church that say, and here's why these laws are wrong. Here's who we are as human beings. This is what we learned from Jesus, or in any faith, what God does as present in our midst. So advocacy is a part of that picture. Let me say one other thing to the person that answered the question. There is this notion, well, progressive churches are just the Democratic Party of prayer. Here's what I would do as a pastor, and it's hard. I would do this. I would say, here are some of the things I think. I'd be honest about my own thoughts. I want a mission committee and an advocacy committee that will decide what they want to do that they think is important in changing legislation and changing our punitive laws about drug policy when it comes to that. But I invite everybody else in the congregation to participate and speak about what they believe. And let me tell you what that means. I was doing this kind of work at Fourth Presbyterian Church in downtown Chicago. I don't know how many of you have heard of Martin Marty, but he was a very well-known professor at the University of Chicago Divinity School. He happened to be there, and he was sitting in on my conference. I was honored to have him there. And I said, Marty, how do you feel about this? What do you think about advocacy in churches? And he didn't say, oh, I think it's good, I think it's bad. But his answer was very telling. He said, Al, I can imagine a church in which you have a committee that's concerned about housing, about affordable housing. You mentioned homelessness. I can imagine a church that says we ought to have a progressive income tax in Illinois. You have a committee around that. They're advocating for that. And he said, I can imagine, a whole bunch of other, and including some, quote, Republicans, probably, that says we shouldn't increase taxes. Let's not have the tax increase that our governor is calling about. And they'll have a committee about that. And he said, all of a sudden, you will have what I would call an advocacy church. In other words, why break through that notion that only certain people are on the mission committee and are bringing forth laws? Invite other people to bring forward their views. One other story. This is a form of advocacy. I said, who you invite to preach is a form of advocacy. In my own home church, it was at the time of Obamacare, just coming along. And actually, I'm privileged to have lived 8 blocks from Obama in Hyde Park. Illinois, and he was my state senator when I was going to Springfield, the state capital, to be an advocate. And just to show you how things change, I think, oh, well, I know he's on my side. He's going to believe in all the things I believe in, all the bills that we're sponsoring, not sponsoring, but advocating for. He believes in. But I thought, well, I probably ought to go by and see him. I mean, I probably ought to tell him who we are. We're talking about the future president of the United States. The story I wanted to tell was about Obamacare before it was called that. Maybe when it was called that. In any event, I said, Susan, my pastor was named Susan Johnson, why don't we have a debate in our church? Why don't we bring in somebody who's all for, a public health care system, and let's bring in somebody who's absolutely against it. And she looked at me and the blood drained from her face and she said, Al, you're scaring me to death. So I understand where that question came from, but over time, if the congregation knows that you're serious about hearing all views, if you do it with touch and care and compassion and understanding, I think it's possible in most churches, not all churches, but some churches. Yes.
The person who made that comment, Warner,
I'm sorry.
also has said that she is just a member, don't have a leadership role, and also a mom of 2 teenage boys. I'm not sure what I can do. I feel like I alone cannot overcome the inertia, the advocacy in my church, and there's no talk of the school to prison pipeline.
Well, I don't have a theoretical answer to that except to say that you start where you are, and you do it as an individual, and you talk to friends, and don't get beaten down. Write something in your newsletter. Simply reach out, act as an individual, tell people about what you're doing, and in many cases, the truth will catch on. Not always, but you simply have to act as individuals. Yes, sir.
The question of how to preach or how to address a congregation with these sensitive issues has come up very frequently in this discussion. And just a general worthwhile strategy. It's not very often that people are receptive to changing their.
You need to speak up.
It's not very often that people are actually receptive to changing their big picture kind of ideas, right? So the idea of preaching about something that is a hot button news issue or a big ideological thing is a very challenging and daunting task. But the idea of introducing a human being who can tell a story that people can relate to is the thin end of the wedge for a lot of those bigger ideas. And I think that's a critical idea. Right? So your ministry as a pastor or as a layperson in your community, connecting with people who are suffering from addiction, opioid abuse, government neglect, incarceration, racism, whatever it is, give them a place to tell their story. That's absolutely huge. If you do get the chance to talk about big picture ideas, and I'm just listening to your stuff about the North Shore people not wanting to hear about the stories, but the big picture ideas, the whole macroeconomics of incarceration and the ideology of punishment is just mathematically wrong. It is a complete limitation. It's shackles on our economic system. And if we're keeping people in a place where they're failing from reaching their full potential, educatively, influentially, or as, just as children of God, our whole society suffers, and the economy is actually a decent benchmark for that, right? Are they fitting into a system that's supporting them and giving them a place to thrive, or are we taking people and putting them into a can so that they don't bother us so much?
Well, these questions are so real, and I should have thought to bring forward what you've said so eloquently, the notion of simply telling stories, getting people to tell their stories. I'm on the board of a group called St. Leonard's Ministries in Chicago, which is one of the few organizations, it's I think the best one in the Chicago metropolitan area, for helping people who come out of prison by, in fact, giving them a place to live and job training and a broad range of other programs and skills. And so in my church, the mission committee is inviting a number of groups to speak. And one of them is going to be those folks who are at St. Leonard's Ministries who have a story to tell. And that opens minds. I mean, the greatest human gap we have is the fact that we all have different experiences. And I don't know if it's Byron Stevenson, whom some of you have heard of, made a movie about his life. He's a great advocate against the death penalty, a lawyer serving people on death row. But he says you have to give people different experiences. And so how do we do that? So who you invite to speak is a perfect example. Now,
Could I just very
Sure.
quickly about the bomb I dropped on my congregation a couple of years ago?
please.
It's a downtown church. We had this great stewardship idea of having 1-minute videos that we would put up on our Facebook page of why you come to this church. Nobody thought of it, but we did a 1-minute video of the homeless guy
Yeah.
who sleeps in our yard and asked him why he sleeps there. And he said, because this is the holiest place in town.
Yeah.
It's the place where I'm sure I can get, I can get better.
Add in Arthur Murray online, speaking.
Hello, Arthur.
Speaking as a pastor, it is a gift to me when people in our congregation take on advocacy as their ministry. It's very difficult to get the church to support as a whole, but to bless individuals or small groups in this work is very possible. And as a follow-up, as a pastor, I can offer the pulpit to diverse voices. I can present educational opportunities and the space for folks to share their stories. But if we wait for everyone to be on the same page before starting advocacy, it will never happen. Small groups can start that work anytime. Thanks, Arthur. And everybody, make sure you really speak up.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I'm going, since we only have about 10 minutes left, I'm going to kind of cut to the chase in terms of, straight up hard advocacy. I could spend some time asking how you feel about legalizing marijuana. A lot of my work over the last 5 years has been literally traveling to probably 15 states, talking to pastors, asking them to join the cause in their state. We now have medical marijuana legal in 36 states. 36 states. We have cannabis legalized for recreational adult use in 15 states, and the District of Columbia would make it 16. For someone who yesterday asked a question of Tim or gave the impression, and I can't remember who it was or quite how it was said, how do we ever change these things? I mean, it was the person who was working with folks, I think, in prison, and it wasn't your husband, it was someone who was asking that kind of question. He said, I see all this, and how do we ever change it? Well, you change it step by step through public persuasion. You can change how people think through your arguments, through discussion, through openness, through listening, but with your arguments. Let me use marijuana as an example. 20 years ago, before the Drug Policy Alliance was started, which is the major organization in drug policy advocacy, I would say the numbers were 15 to 20% thought adult cannabis ought to be legal for recreational use. That has changed because of the arguments that have been brought forward. And the third handout that I gave you was testimony that I gave actually in front of the Illinois state legislature, who legalized cannabis 2 years ago. And the arguments are there, and the arguments make sense. And if you say look, Donald Trump told us that if you say the same thing over and over and over again, even if it's profoundly wrong, and even if it counters public sense, people are going to believe it. Well, arguments that really have merit, hopefully have in the long run opportunity for more traction. Truth is not relative. So if the bad arguments can be believed and accepted when they're repeated, well, what about the arguments that really have merit and truth? And those arguments are there for marijuana. I'm not going to take up more time because we don't have enough to get your views on legalizing marijuana. An awful lot would come out in that discussion. Um, but I will tell you what the end of the game is going to be that will end the war on drugs. And it's going to be not just legalizing cannabis, it's going to be decriminalizing all drugs, low-level possession of all drugs. Now, when I started, I didn't know the difference between decriminalization and legalization. Decriminalization means that something is a civil offense. It's like a traffic ticket. You're not a criminal. Defelonization is an intermediate step where you're still a criminal, but you're not charged with a felony, but it's still a crime. Decriminalization takes the crime element out. And so decriminalizing, saying, and that's what's happened in Portugal that Tim described. Still not legal to use drugs in Portugal, but you're not arrested for it. The police refer you to, in Portugal, what's called a decommissioning group. And a police, a doctor, social worker talk to you if they think you don't have a problem that's really severe. Go, my boy, and don't do it again. But otherwise, you have the opportunity for treatment in Portugal. And that is what should happen in this country. And the great thing to say is that it is happening already. It started. And it started in Oregon, where this past, I think, March or April, they indeed pass a bill that decriminalizes all drugs, all low-level possession, and you can get into intricate debates. What is low-level? And that's important. So we're not talking about massive uses, which means you may be a trafficker. And the way to pass those bills, if you get to this point, and you will, is to really consider them treatment opportunity bills. We're even in our defelonization bill, one step short of decriminalization in Illinois. Again, I said names are important. Clergy for No Drug Policy is an important name. We debated for about a year the name of this bill in Illinois, and we were calling it not drug liberalization bill or other things. We're calling it reducing barriers to recovery bill. How do you recover if you come out and you have a criminal charge on your record? How do you recover if you come out, if you're even in jail for 25 days before you're even brought to court, in which case you've lost which is what happens with marijuana offenses, most of which are tossed out, but you can sit in jail for a period of time. You've lost your job, your family wonders what's going on, you're separated from your kids. So it's reducing barriers to recovery. That bill passed in Oregon, and it's going to pass this nation. And how do I know? Because change does happen. I've seen the progression. I started out in Illinois with medical cannabis, and I can't remember. There were a few states that had it. Illinois wasn't the first. And I'll be honest with you, my wife always says, don't say this, but I do. I started out because she'll think people will misunderstand me. You won't. I started out with it as a wedge issue. I thought, well, you know, if we can get people to, it was the only thing you could talk about in the legislature when it came to cannabis. So I said, I'll start out with it and then maybe that will pass and we can get to the really important thing. I will tell you this, it took me about 2 weeks of working on medical cannabis and I was a convert. I didn't care if my life stopped after we passed medical cannabis because I saw whom it helped. And this, again, attitudes change. You know how medical cannabis passed in Illinois? And this is how cannabis changes. It is because we had people who benefited from medical cannabis who told their story. And my old state senator, I remember weeping in my office as I saw the debate in Springfield. I couldn't be down there at the time. My own state senator, Kwame Raoul, started tears coming down his cheeks, said, the last days of my father's life, who was suffering from cancer, would have been very, very different if we'd had medical cannabis. Even in those days before we knew more about medical cannabis, we knew without any serious reservation that it helps reduce these some of the nausea symptoms of cancer. It helps, when you talk about heart diseases, it helps with multiple sclerosis. One of our advocates was someone who could not live a normal life. She was confined to her apartment. Cannabis became available to her illegally, and she used it, and she could live a semblance of a normal life. Third guy, he was our poster child for white collar audiences, went to Dartmouth, freshman year, realized he had Crohn's disease, had to go home, had hard time recovering, hard time getting back to college, became a lawyer with Jones Day, a big international law firm. But still, he could only show up for work if he had some kind of regimen of medical cannabis. He was our poster child for that. You tell their stories, that passed. People began to say, hey, maybe this drug isn't, maybe drugs per se aren't so terrible. And even then in that debate, some people were saying maybe we ought to legalize. So, but the last thing, we've only got about 3 minutes, that I want to leave you with is this third book. This is the answer to people who say, and you and I were talking about this, Joy, well, cannabis, we don't want kids to use cannabis. The first thing I say is all of my work has nothing to do with encouraging drug use. It does have to do with the fact that drugs are a reality in our society. I wish I could have said this to Jeff Sessions, as our Attorney General, who said, all drug use is bad. Drugs are not going away. The issue isn't drugs. The issue is drug abuse. And Tim said last night what I believe, it's not about the drugs, it's about how we respond to drugs. And for people who do respond in ways that are hurtful, how we minimize that abuse and how we deal with that abuse. This book is called Regulating, for those who can't see it, Regulating Vice, Misguided Prohibitions and Realistic Controls. It's by a man named Jim Leitzel, who chairs the public policy department at the University of Chicago. And the title tells us a lot. He defines vice as anything that gives pleasure, people are drawn to do, but it is also harmful. And so he would talk about all the addictions, not only substances, but processes like gambling, like pornography. Some people would say that shopping can be addictive, and I believe that. I believe with Tim Rohr, Father Richard Rohr, that we are indeed all at some level addictive, and our theology starts when we lose our wholeness and we have false idols that keep us from worshiping the Lord thy God. But what Leitzel says is that the response to the reality of possible addiction, the reality of potential vice, isn't prohibition. Kids know that. If you tell them not to use marijuana because all these horrible things are going to happen, one, they know you're lying to them just because it's not true. And they certainly aren't going to buy the old DARE programs of Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. So the answer is the right kind of education. And I was going to ask you, Joy, we'll have a chance to discuss this. What is the best kind of education? It isn't the DARE programs to scare people. I heard one great presentation that tried to say that, and I want to know more about this, it's kind of education programs that talk about kids sharing their relationships with each other, that bring them into community, that keep them feeling less isolated, and that also in some way gives them a sense of themselves. Who am I? I do have the capacity to become what Richard Rohr would call my true self. So education of whatever kind, and I want to learn more about what education is working. And one of the advantages of legalizing cannabis is you get honest education. Schools don't get away with that scaring people stuff. They now have to deal with the fact that it is legal. And what do kids really need to hear? And how are they going to cope? And what do they need to understand about drugs? That's the right kind of education. So Jim talks about education, but he also really talks about regulation. And Tim was quite eloquent last night about that. We need a system not that says no drugs, because prohibition doesn't work, but you need to create the environment in which they are available. You need to tell people what they're getting. You need to know what the dosage is. You need to break that connection between as Tim said, capitalism and addictive substances. We have a summer home in Canada, year-round home actually. And I don't know how you know how alcohol is sold in Canada. Alcohol is sold in Canada. You go into a plain building and it's sold in outlets that are run by the government. That would be my dream. And the people that opposed cannabis, adult use cannabis, that I advocated for in Illinois, wanted that. And I simply had to compromise. I realized we wouldn't get a bill passed if we started In fact, I sold my soul a little bit because I knew the people that were funding the campaign to get cannabis legalized were the people that were going to want to get into the business. And I was willing to go with that because I think at least having it out there in an honest way, regulating it insofar as you can, and not having kids picking stuff up in the schoolyards where they all can get it anyway is the best way. And because I do think there is a domino effect to ending the war on drugs. There'll be cannabis. It will be a decriminalization of low-level possession of all drugs. Legalization of all drugs is a world that I think I know something about. That's a long way off, and that will be very, very complicated. I think it can be done in a way that ultimately will be healthy. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I appreciate your
quick
participation.
question.
Yes.
For the people online, is your blog on your website?
Yes, it's newdrugpolicy.org. Go there and simply go to in the news, and it has every blog we've done for the last 5 years.
Okay, in the news on your website,
Yep.
and that link has been posted by both Arthur and I. So,
Good.
all right, thank you.
You asked what kind of education gets the best
Yes,
results.
please.
I would suggest this is what my old boss Larry Sherman's research shows by an order of magnitude in terms of results in public policy change
Yes.
is not public education, but police education.
What does that mean?
It means like investing in educating the police
Oh.
departments about addiction,
Yeah.
opioid abuse, those sorts of patterns of behavior in places where I know that's a whole can of worms to open up here at the very end.
Yeah.
But I think if we're advocating for something, I think it better relationships with our police department and advocating to them about compassionate treatment
Yep.
of people in society is a place where the church can make a big difference.
They can, and that is happening. It started, one of my big advocacy programs was diversion. I kind of feel, I didn't discover it, but I was one of the first to realize it was happening. And I brought police in to talk about diversion because there were a few police that were doing that, even some state's attorneys that were, diverting people to treatment. And that is happening as a matter of law. We have a bill in Illinois that encourages that. That's kind of been preempted, and maybe in a good way, by the whole funding the police movement. Because at its best, defunding the police isn't saying less money, it's saying reallocate it to people that can bring services to people who need it, that right now police who are not educated as they should be are being asked to do something that they're not trained to do. So your
All
point
right.
is right on.
Your point is right on, but we have reached our limit of time. Thank you very much, Reverend Al Sharp. And thank you all of the people who have been on the chat with Zoom. And
Thank you all.